After a terrible car accident, I called my husband and asked him to pick me up from the ER. He texted back, "I'm at lunch with my female best friend, can't just leave." I replied, "Okay." What the police officer said when they approached his table at the restaurant made him wish he hadn't left me waiting. The text message arrived while I was still bleeding. "Can't leave lunch with Charlotte right now. Her ex is stalking her. Call an Uber? Sorry babe." I stared at my husband's words through the spiderweb screen of my phone, my dislocated shoulder screaming with every shallow breath, and typed back with my one good hand, "Okay." That single word would end our 8-year marriage, though Tyler didn't know it yet. He was too busy comforting Charlotte Thomas over her latest manufactured crisis to realize his wife was lying in Riverside General's emergency room, choosing between rage and morphine. The nurses had asked me 3 times if they could call someone else. Anyone else. But I kept staring at that message, reading it over and over like maybe the words would rearrange themselves into something that made sense. My husband of 8 years had just suggested I take an Uber home from the emergency room after a car accident that could have killed me. Because Charlotte Thomas, his college friend with the trust fund and the endless romantic disasters, needed him more. This morning felt like a different lifetime now. I'd stood in our kitchen at 6:30 a.m., making Tyler's breakfast exactly how he liked it. 2 eggs over easy, 3 strips of bacon crispy enough to shatter, wheat toast with just a whisper of butter. 8 years of making the same breakfast and I could do it without thinking. My hands knew the motions while my mind wandered to the pharmacy conference dinner that night, where I'd receive my 5-year service award. Tyler had promised to be there. Or rather, he'd said he'd try. "Charlotte's having another crisis," he'd announced over breakfast, his eyes never leaving his phone screen. The soft smile playing at his lips was the one I used to see when I'd walk into a room. Now it belonged to her text messages. Another one? I'd kept my voice neutral while cracking eggs with perhaps more force than necessary. "That's the 3rd crisis this month. Her ex is stalking her. She's scared, Hannah." Marcus, the ex-boyfriend, had been stalking Charlotte for 6 months according to her. Strange how the stalking only seemed to occur on Thursday afternoons when Tyler had his longest lunch break. Strange how it never quite escalated to actually calling the police. I'd wanted to point out these inconsistencies, but I'd learned that defending Charlotte was Tyler's new religion. Instead, I'd reminded him about the pharmacy dinner. His response was predictable. "I'll try to make it, but if Charlotte needs me, she would need him. She always did on Thursdays." The thing about Thursday lunches was that they'd started so innocently I couldn't even be properly angry at first. 6 months ago, Tyler had brought Charlotte into my pharmacy at Riverside General. She needed anxiety medication and Tyler wanted to make sure she got the right treatment. I'd watched from behind the counter as she touched his arm while laughing at something he said. The gesture was casual, intimate, familiar. Tyler had straightened his tie when she complimented it, a peacock preening for attention. "Charlotte's going through a rough divorce," he'd explained that night. "She doesn't have anyone else in town she can really talk to." One lunch became 2. Monthly became weekly. 1 hour stretched to 3. Always on Thursdays when I worked my late shift and wouldn't be home until after 9. I tried talking to him about it last month. We were lying in bed and I could smell her perfume on his shirt. Something expensive and floral that made our bedroom smell like a department store. "Do you think Charlotte might be taking advantage of your kindness?" I'd asked carefully. Tyler had turned to look at me with such genuine surprise that for a moment, I wondered if I was wrong. "Taking advantage? Hannah, she's falling apart. Her ex is psychologically abusing her. He has panic attacks. She needs support. She has parents 20 minutes away. He has a therapist. She has other friends. But she trusts me," Tyler had said, as if that explained everything. As if her trust was more important than our marriage. Eleanor Wilson, Tyler's mother, had cornered me at our wedding reception 8 years ago. She'd had too much champagne, and her words came with the sharp edges of truth that alcohol tends to reveal. "You're good for him," she'd said, not as a compliment but as an assessment. "Tyler needs someone practical. Someone who won't let him drift. You'll keep him grounded." I'd thought she was welcoming me to the family. Now I understood she'd been hiring me for a position. Tyler's keeper. The practical one who worked 12-hour shifts while he played at his father's accounting firm, taking 3-hour lunches without consequence. The morning of the accident, I'd watched Tyler get ready for work with the attention of someone memorizing details. He wore the burgundy tie Charlotte had complimented last week, the one I'd given him 2 Christmases ago that had lived in his closet until she'd mentioned how it brought out his eyes. His cologne was stronger than usual. He'd trimmed his beard with unusual precision. "Big meeting today?" I'd asked. "Just Thursday," he'd replied, and we both knew what that meant. I'd left for my shift at the hospital thinking about when we'd stopped really seeing each other. When did I become furniture in my own marriage? When did his phone become more interesting than conversations with his wife? The questions followed me through my morning routine at the pharmacy, through the lunch break I ate alone in the break room, through the afternoon that would end with my car crumpled against a concrete barrier and my shoulder forced from its socket. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent the morning filling prescriptions for Charlotte's anxiety medication. The same medication she'd needed for 6 months of Thursday crises that never seemed to resolve. The same medication that gave her a reason to text my husband at all hours with questions about side effects and dosage adjustments. Now, lying in the emergency room with monitors beeping around me, I thought about all the Thursday nights I'd come home to find Tyler already in bed, pretending to be asleep. The credit card charges at the Sterling room that were always just a little too high for a lunch between friends. The way he'd started keeping his phone face down during dinner. Officer Morrison appeared at my bedside again, her expression carefully professional. "Mrs. Wilson, we've tried calling your husband 3 more times. The calls are going straight to voicemail now." He turned off his phone rather than be interrupted during his lunch with Charlotte. The recognition of that fact settled over me like a blanket made of lead. Tyler had actively chosen to be unreachable while his wife lay in the emergency room. "Officer Morrison," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the medication making everything feel distant and foggy. "I know exactly where my husband is. The Sterling room on 5th Street. He's at his usual table by the window with Charlotte Thomas." I paused, tasting blood from where I'd bitten my lip. "Would you mind delivering the message in person? I'm worried he doesn't understand how serious this was." Officer Morrison studied my face for a moment, and I saw understanding dawn in her expression. "We can certainly do that, Mrs. Wilson. The Sterling room, you said?" "Every Thursday," I confirmed. "Like clockwork." The pharmacy clock showed 6:47 p.m. when Margaret, my supervisor, caught me at the door with my coat already half on. Her expression carried that particular blend of desperation and authority that meant she was about to ask for something I wouldn't want to give. "Hannah, I hate to ask, but the controlled substances inventory is off by 3 counts. State's coming Monday for inspection. I really need someone who knows what they're doing to help me sort this out tonight." My hand paused on the door handle. 3 counts off meant at least 2 hours of checking every log, every signature, every transfer. The conference dinner started at 7:30, my award presentation at 8. Tyler had already made it clear that Charlotte's crisis took priority, but maybe if I showed up late with the actual award in hand, it would mean something. Maybe he'd look up from his phone and remember who he married. "I'm sorry, Margaret. Tonight's the conference dinner. Remember? The 5-year recognition." Margaret's face shifted to understanding, then something else. Pity maybe. She knew about Tyler's Thursday lunches like everyone at the hospital knew. Gossip traveled through medical facilities faster than any virus. "Of course. Go get your award, honey. You've earned it." The rain had started during my shift, a gentle patter against the hospital windows that had turned into a proper downpour by the time I reached my car. The wipers squealed against the windshield, rubber aged beyond usefulness but never quite bad enough to replace. Another thing on the list of things Tyler said we'd handle together but never did. I pulled out of the hospital parking garage into streets already flooding at the corners. The conference dinner was downtown at the Marriott, 15 minutes in good weather, probably 30 in this mess. My phone sat in the cup holder and I kept glancing at it, waiting for Tyler to text that he was on his way, that Charlotte's crisis had resolved, that he remembered his wife was being honored tonight. Nothing. The rain hammered harder as I turned onto Madison Avenue. The street lights created halos in the water streaming down my windshield, and I had to lean forward to see properly. The radio played something old and melancholy, a song my mother used to hum while doing dishes. I thought about calling Tyler one more time, but what would be the point? He'd made his choice clear at breakfast. Charlotte needed him. Charlotte always needed him on Thursdays. I was thinking about what I'd say if anyone asked where Tyler was tonight when I approached the intersection at 5th and Madison. The light was green, had been green for several seconds as I coasted toward it at 25 miles per hour, cautious in the rain. I was already entering the intersection when movement caught my peripheral vision. A lifted pickup truck, one of those unnecessarily huge things college boys drive to feel important, barreling down 5th Street like the rain didn't exist. The last coherent thought I had was that he wasn't stopping. This kid in his massive truck, probably 19 or 20, wearing a backwards baseball cap, was going to run that red light at full speed. The impact folded my car door into my ribs. The sound was extraordinary, nothing like movies make it seem. It was wet and sharp and final, metal surrendering to metal in the rain. My body moved in directions it wasn't meant to move, and suddenly the steering wheel was somewhere near my right ear and the door was touching my left hip in a way that made geometry stop making sense. Time did something strange then. Everything slowed down and sped up simultaneously. I could see individual raindrops on what was left of my windshield, each one perfect and separate. My mother's voice floated through my head with absolute clarity. A memory from 20 years ago when she'd caught me leaving the house in ratty underwear. Always wear clean underwear, Hannah. What if you're in an accident? What will the paramedics think? The absurdity of that thought made me want to laugh, but my chest wouldn't expand properly. Something warm was running into my eyes, and when I tried to wipe it away, my left arm wouldn't respond to commands. It just hung there at an angle that made my stomach lurch. My wedding ring caught the streetlight through the shattered window, gold covered in red that I knew was blood but couldn't quite process as mine. 8 years wearing that ring. 8 years of believing it meant something more than jewelry. Now it was just metal on a finger attached to an arm that wouldn't move, covered in blood from a head wound I couldn't see but could definitely feel. The radio was still playing. Through the chaos of steam from the destroyed engine and rain pouring through where windows used to be, that melancholy song continued like nothing had happened. My brain, probably in shock, decided this was vitally important information. The song was "The Night We Met" by Lord Huron. I could identify it despite everything else shutting down. Some part of me found this hilarious. Voices started penetrating the bubble of shock. Male Young panicked. The kid from the truck sang variations of "I didn't see her," and "The light was yellow," and "Is she okay?" over and over like a broken record. Other voices joined, calmer ones giving instructions about not moving me, about calling 911, about checking for breathing. Then familiar voices. Professional ones. The paramedics arrived faster than seemed possible, though time had become negotiable, so maybe it had been hours. I recognized the controlled urgency in their movements, the way they communicated in short, efficient sentences. They were doing the initial assessment, checking airways, breathing, circulation. The basic stuff you learn first day of any medical training. "Ma'am, can you hear me? Don't try to move. We're going to help you." The young paramedic leaning over me couldn't have been older than 25. Her partner looked even younger. I wanted to tell them I knew what they were doing, that I understood the medical terminology, that I worked at Riverside General, but when I opened my mouth, what came out was dislocated shoulder. Possible concussion. Multiple lacerations to the forehead and scalp. They exchanged glances over my head, the look medical professionals share when a patient might have head trauma but is speaking too clearly to dismiss. "Are you a medical professional?" the older one asked while establishing for access with practiced ease. "Pharmacy. Riverside General. Was supposed to be at dinner. 5-year award." The words came out disconnected, like beads from a broken necklace scattering across pavement. They worked around me with choreographed efficiency. Cervical collar to protect my spine. Careful examination of the shoulder that made me see stars despite whatever they'd pushed through the fore. Pressure on the head wound that was apparently more impressive than I'd realized based on how quickly they moved after seeing it. "We're going to extract you now. This might hurt." Might hurt was medical professional speak for, "This is going to be agony." They cut away what was left of my door with tools that sounded like angry metal wasps. Every movement sent fire through my shoulder and ribs. I focused on their faces, on the rain hitting their uniforms, on anything except the pain that made breathing feel like drowning in reverse. That's when Officer Janet Morrison appeared at the ambulance doors as they loaded me in. I knew her face immediately despite the fog of shock and medication. She picked up her mother's blood pressure medication every month, always chatty, always asking about my family, my husband, my life. "Hannah. Oh honey, it's Janet Morrison. You're going to be okay. We need to contact someone for you. Who should we call? The automatic response came without thought, programmed by 8 years of marriage. Tyler Wilson. My husband. I gave her the number while part of my brain screamed that he wouldn't answer, that Charlotte's stalker crisis would be more important than his wife's actual emergency, that Thursday lunches were sacred while Thursday accidents were inconvenient. The ambulance doors closed with a definitive thud that seemed to seal me into a different world entirely. The ride to Riverside General took 12 minutes according to the digital clock above my head, though time had become elastic and unreliable since the moment that pickup truck had rearranged my evening plans along with my skeletal structure. The emergency room ceiling tiles came into focus slowly as they transferred me from the ambulance gurney to a hospital bed. Someone had tried to make them cheerful once, painting tiny clouds in some of the squares, but years of fluorescent light exposure had yellowed them into something that looked more like old teeth than sky. I counted them while Dr. Webb manipulated my shoulder, his hands professional and surprisingly gentle for someone who looked like he'd been awake for 36 hours straight. This is going to hurt, he warned, which was doctor speak for prepare yourself for agony. On 3. 1, 2. He pulled on 2. The grinding pop of my shoulder sliding back into place sent white lightning through my entire left side. Stars exploded across my vision, and for a moment I was somewhere else entirely, remembering Tyler last month when I'd asked him to open a jar of pickles. You're stronger than you pretend to be, Hannah, he'd said with that particular tone of mild annoyance he'd perfected over 8 years. You don't need me for everything. The irony of that memory hit harder than the pain medication they were pushing through my fore. Here I was with a legitimately dislocated shoulder, not pretending anything, and Tyler was nowhere to be found. I wondered if he'd believe this was real or if he'd think I was being dramatic about this too, the way he claimed I was dramatic about Charlotte monopolizing his time. There we go, Dr. Webb said, satisfaction evident as he tested the joint's mobility. Clean reduction. You'll be sore for a few weeks but no permanent damage. Nurse Patricia appeared at my bedside as Dr. Webb moved on to his next patient. Patricia had been working emergency for 20 years. And it showed in the careful way she held herself, like she'd learned to carry other people's traumas without letting them seep into her bones. Her expression held that particular combination of sympathy and professionalism that suggested she had news I wouldn't want to hear. Honey, we've been trying to reach your husband. The contact number you gave Officer Morrison. She held up the department phone, showing the call log. 3 attempts, straight to voicemail each time. 3 calls. 3 times the hospital had tried to inform Tyler his wife was in the emergency room. I knew exactly where he was, could picture him at the Sterling room with his phone face down on the white tablecloth, giving Charlotte his complete attention while she detailed whatever fictional crisis justified his absence. But knowing and accepting were different things entirely. Let me try, I said, reaching for my phone with my good hand. The screen was a spider web of cracks from the accident, but it still worked. My fingers shook as I typed, though I couldn't tell if it was from the medication or from the fear that I already knew how this would play out. Had an accident. I'm at Riverside General ER. Dislocated shoulder, concussion. Can you come get me? The message showed delivered immediately. Then those 3 dots appeared and my heart did something stupid and hopeful in my chest. He was typing. He'd seen it. Maybe the calls hadn't gone through properly. Maybe he'd been in a meeting. Maybe there was still a reasonable explanation that didn't involve him choosing Charlotte over his injured wife. The dots disappeared and reappeared several times, like he was writing and deleting, trying to find the right words. Each time they vanished, my hope dimmed a little more, until finally his response arrived with the gentle vibration that had once made me smile when I saw his name on my screen. Can't leave lunch with Charlotte right now, her ex is stalking her. Call an Uber? Sorry babe. I read it 3 times, certain I was misunderstanding something. The concussion must be affecting my reading comprehension. Surely my husband of 8 years hadn't just suggested I take an Uber home from the emergency room. Surely he hadn't prioritized Charlotte's recurring Thursday drama over his wife's actual medical emergency. But there it was in black and white, or rather in the blue and gray of our text conversation. 23 words that managed to capture everything wrong with our marriage in a single message. The casual dismissal. The prioritization of someone else's manufactured crisis. The suggestion that I handle my own emergency transportation like I'd gotten a flat tire instead of nearly died. Something broke inside my chest as I stared at that message. Not my heart exactly, though that was certainly involved. It was bigger than that, more structural. The framework that had held my life together for 8 years. The basic belief that when it really mattered, when the chips were down and everything was falling apart, Tyler would choose me. Would choose us. Would remember the vows he'd made in front of our families and friends. Patricia was still standing there, watching my face change as I processed my husband's response. She'd probably seen this exact scenario play out hundreds of times in different variations. The spouse who couldn't be bothered. The partner who had somewhere more important to be. The emergency contact who wasn't interested in the emergency. "Is someone else coming to get you, honey?" she asked gently. I looked at my phone again, at Tyler's message sitting there like evidence in a case I hadn't realized I was building. Then I looked at Patricia, at her kind face that had seen too much disappointment to be surprised by any of it anymore. "No," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears. "Come," decided. "But I need to make another call." I scrolled through my contacts until I found Officer Morrison's number, still saved from when she'd given it to me months ago during the pharmacy break-ins. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm with concern. "Hannah, how are you doing, honey? I've been worried." "I'm stable, thank you." "Janet, I have an unusual request." My voice remained steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "My husband isn't answering his phone, but I know exactly where he is. The Sterling Room on 5th Street. He's at his usual table by the window with Charlotte Thomas." There was a pause on the other end, and I could feel Janet processing what I was really asking. Would it be possible for someone to notify him in person? I continued, each word deliberate and clear. "I'm just worried he doesn't understand how serious this was." Another pause, longer this time. When Janet spoke again, her tone had shifted slightly, carrying an understanding that made me want to cry for the first time since the accident. "We can certainly do that, Hannah." "The Sterling Room, you said?" "We'll send officers right over." "Thank you." "He'll be at the table by the window. The one with the view of the city. With Charlotte Thomas. They have it every Thursday." "Every Thursday," Janet repeated, and those two words carried more weight than they should have. After I hung up, I lay back against the hospital pillow and closed my eyes, picturing what was about to happen. The Sterling Room with its crystal glasses and carefully folded napkins. Tyler leaning forward to catch every word of Charlotte's latest crisis. Her hand probably on his arm, that casual touch that meant everything and nothing. Then the door would open. Officers would walk in, their uniforms dark and official against all that white tablecloth elegance. Conversations would stop. Forks would pause midway to mouths. And everyone in that restaurant would turn to watch as the police approached Tyler's table. Charlotte's perfectly manicured hand would fly to her mouth. Tyler's face would cycle through confusion, annoyance, and then finally understanding. The silence would be complete as Officer Morrison explained that his wife had been in a serious accident, that she was in the emergency room, that they'd been trying to reach him for hours. The emergency room had developed its own rhythm around me while I waited for whatever came next. The steady beeping of monitors, the soft squeak of nurses' shoes on polished floors, the distant murmur of other people's crises being managed with professional efficiency. I had closed my eyes, not sleeping but floating in that medicated space between consciousness and dreams, when my phone buzzed against the hospital blanket. 3 texts arrived in rapid succession, Tyler's name lighting up my cracked screen like a warning signal. "Hannah, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize it was that serious. Why didn't the hospital call more than once?" Sending police was completely unnecessary and vindictive. I stared at the messages, watching them blur and refocus as my concussion made reading an adventure in patience. The progression was almost fascinating in its predictability. Apology, deflection, accusation. The Tyler Wilson playbook for avoiding responsibility, delivered in real time while I lay in a hospital bed with 15 stitches decorating my forehead. Another buzz. "You're being dramatic about this." 4 messages. 4 different attempts to make this my fault. The accident was serious enough to warrant an apology but not serious enough to leave lunch. The hospital should have tried harder to reach him, as if 3 calls to voicemail weren't sufficient. Sending police was vindictive, not a necessary response to his deliberate unavailability. And finally, the crown jewel of his deflection strategy. I was being dramatic. My good hand trembled as I set the phone aside without responding. What was there to say? That a dislocated shoulder and head trauma weren't dramatic enough for his attention? That his wife bleeding in an emergency room should have waited patiently for Charlotte's crisis to resolve? The curtain around my bed rustled and David walked in looking like he'd driven through hell to get here. My younger brother still wore his real estate showing clothes, the crisp blue shirt and khakis that made him look trustworthy to potential buyers, though now they were wrinkled and rain-spotted. His face, usually set in an easy smile that sold houses and charmed clients, was carved from stone. 2 hours, he said, crossing to my bedside in 3 quick strides. 2 hours I've been driving, thinking about all the ways I was going to support you through recovery, worried sick about my sister. His hand found mine, gentle despite the anger radiating from him. Then I get here and the nurse tells me your husband suggested you take an Uber home. David. No, Hannah. Just no. He pulled the visitor's chair close with his free hand, sitting down without letting go of mine. Show me the messages. I handed him my phone, watching his face transform as he read Tyler's texts. The progression was almost theatrical. Disbelief, anger, then something colder and more calculated that I recognized from his business dealings. This was David in acquisition mode, except instead of property he was calculating the complete removal of Tyler from my life. 8 years, he muttered, still scrolling through the messages. 8 years I've watched him treat you like staff instead of a wife. But this is next-level selfishness. He pulled out his own phone, fingers flying across the screen with practiced efficiency. I'm calling Martinez, the locksmith. He owes me a favor. Can have your locks changed by tomorrow morning. David, I don't know if. And Morrison Moving Company. They specialize in quick extractions. Divorce situations, domestic problems, that sort of thing. Very discreet, very professional. The speed of it made my head spin more than the concussion. It's been 8 years, David. I can't just what? Demand basic human decency from your husband? Expect him to show up when you're in the hospital? His voice softened slightly, but his fingers never stopped typing. Hannah, he chose lunch with another woman over your medical emergency. There's no coming back from that. My phone buzzed again. Not Tyler this time, but an Instagram notification. Charlotte Thomas had sent me a message. I almost didn't open it, too exhausted to deal with whatever drama she wanted to share, but curiosity won. The message was longer than expected, and reading it felt like watching the final piece of Tyler's carefully constructed image crumble into dust. Hannah, I'm mortified by what happened today. When the police arrived at our lunch, I was shocked Tyler hadn't left immediately after your text. I asked him why he didn't go to you right away. I had to pause, my vision swimming slightly before continuing. He said you were always exaggerating things for attention, that you were probably fine and just trying to manipulate him into leaving. Even after the officers explained about the accident, he kept insisting you were being dramatic. I've never been so disgusted with someone in my life. David was reading over my shoulder now, his expression darkening with each word. I had no idea you were actually hurt. He made it sound like you had a tender bender and were making it into something bigger. I'm so sorry for unknowingly participating in this. Tyler is no longer welcome in my life. I hope you recover quickly and find the support you deserve. The message sat there like evidence in a trial I hadn't realized was happening. Tyler had not only dismissed my accident to me but had actively portrayed me as manipulative and attention-seeking to Charlotte. Even when uniformed officers explained I was in the emergency room with significant injuries, he'd maintained the fiction that I was being dramatic. Send me that screenshot, David said quietly. Martinez can be there at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Morrison moving by noon. How do you feel about a formal notice drafted by my lawyer friend, delivered by certified mail? I looked at my brother, this man who'd driven 2 hours without hesitation when I needed him, who was now architecting the dissolution of my marriage with the same precision he used to close real estate deals. He hadn't once said I told you so, though he'd warned me about Tyler years ago, gently at first, then more insistently as the patterns became obvious. He'll say I'm overreacting, I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Let him. While he's saying it, his belongings will be in boxes and the locks will be changed. David squeezed my hand gently. Hannah, he showed you exactly who he is today. When you needed him most, he chose someone else. That's not a husband. That's just some guy you happen to live with. I thought about Tyler at the Sterling Room, How his Thursday routine had been more important than his wife's emergency. How he'd characterized me to Charlotte, painting me as hysterical and manipulative to justify his absence. How even now, after police notification and public humiliation, he was still trying to make this my fault. "Call Martinez," I said, my voice steady despite everything. "8 a.m. tomorrow." David nodded, already pulling up the contact. "And Morrison moving?" "Yoon. Everything of his, packed and ready." My brother smiled for the first time since walking in, though it wasn't a happy expression. It was the smile of someone watching justice finally arrive, even if it came dressed in heartbreak and hospital gowns. "I'll handle everything," he said, and I knew he would. While Tyler was probably still at the Sterling room, trying to salvage his dignity in front of Charlotte and the restaurant patrons who'd witnessed his public shaming, David was already dismantling the life we'd built together with surgical precision. My phone buzzed once more. "Tyler again, we need to talk about this like adults." I looked at the message, then at David, then at my wedding ring still covered in dried blood from the accident. 8 years reduced to this moment, this hospital bed, this decision that wasn't really a decision at all. Tyler had made the choice for both of us when he typed those 23 words suggesting I take an Uber home. David handed me a cup of coffee at 7:45 Friday morning, 15 minutes before Martinez was scheduled to arrive. My shoulder throbbed despite the pain medication, and moving from the bedroom to the couch had taken longer than it should have, but I needed to be present for this. 8 years of marriage couldn't be dismantled from bed. "You sure you want to watch this?" David asked, though he was already arranging pillows to support my injured shoulder. "I need to see it happen. Otherwise, I might convince myself it was all a dream." The doorbell rang at exactly 8 o'clock. Martinez stood there with a toolbox that looked like it had seen 1,000 relationship endings, his weathered face carrying the expression of someone who'd learned not to ask questions about why locks needed changing on a Friday morning. "David Wilson's sister?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "I'll have you secured in about an hour. New deadbolts, new door handles, even gonna change out that back door lock you probably forgot existed." He worked with methodical precision, the sound of drilling and metal on metal filling the townhouse. Halfway through installing the second deadbolt, he paused to take a water break. "You know, I see this situation more than you'd think," he said, wiping his forehead. "Husband forgets wife exists until the locks change. Then suddenly they remember they're married." Morrison moving arrived at 9:30, earlier than expected. 3 people in matching blue shirts who moved through the house with the kind of efficiency that came from practice. The team leader, a woman named Rosa who couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall but carried herself like she could bench press a refrigerator, handed me an inventory sheet. "We'll photograph everything before packing, document any existing damage, treat every item with care regardless of whose it is. Professional and neutral, that's our policy." They started in the bedroom. I could hear them working while I sat on the couch, David beside me with his laptop, drafting emails and making phone calls with quiet efficiency. The sound of tape being pulled from rolls, the soft thud of items being placed in boxes, the occasional question about whether something was mine or his. "The Rolex," Rosa called out. "His anniversary gift from 3 years ago. I'd saved for 6 months to buy that watch, working extra shifts during flu season. Tyler had worn it twice. Golf clubs. His. Those had cost more than I'd spent on car maintenance in 2 years, justified as networking equipment for client relationships that never materialized. The signed baseball in the display case? His. A gift from his father, supposedly valuable, definitely never touched. Each item they packed felt like evidence in a case I hadn't realized I'd been building. The expensive things I'd bought him, trying to make him happy, trying to be the wife he wanted. The hobbies he'd started and abandoned, leaving expensive equipment to gather dust. The designer clothes that had to be dry cleaned, suits that cost more than my monthly student loan payment. Mrs. Chin appeared at the door around 10:30, carrying a container of soup that smelled like comfort and motherhood. She was 73, had lived in the neighborhood for 40 years, and had opinions about everyone that she usually kept to herself. "I saw the locksmith," she said, setting the soup on my coffee table. "About time if you ask me. Mrs. Chin. That man never deserved you. Working all hours while he..." She paused, suddenly very interested in adjusting the lid on the soup container. "While he what?" Her face creased with discomfort. "I don't want to upset you more, dear. You've been through enough. Please. Whatever it is, I need to know. She sighed, settling into the chair across from me with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested most activities. That woman, the one with the white BMW? She's been coming by on Tuesday afternoons sometimes. When you're at work. Stays for an hour or two. Charlotte drove a white BMW. Tuesday afternoons I always worked late, preparing for the Wednesday morning inventory. The information clicked into place like a combination lock finding its numbers. How long? Maybe 3 months. I didn't want to say anything without being sure, and then I wasn't sure how to bring it up, and... It's okay, Mrs. Chen. Thank you for telling me. She reached over and patted my good hand. I brought divorce soup. My mother's recipe. Fed it to myself 40 years ago when I left Mr. Chen. Best decision I ever made. After she left, I sat with this new information, adding it to the growing pile of evidence that my marriage had been over long before yesterday's accident. Charlotte hadn't just been having lunch with Tyler. She'd been coming to our home. To our bed probably while I filled prescriptions and counted pills and worked extra shifts to pay for his expensive tastes. Hannah. Rosa stood in the hallway with a question on her face. The home office. There's a lot of paperwork. How do you want us to handle it? I made myself stand, David's hand on my good arm for support, and walked to what had been Tyler's office. His degrees on the wall, his father's company certifications, photos of him at golf tournaments and business dinners. All of it a carefully constructed image of success that I'd been funding for 8 years. Pack it all. Everything that's his. The wedding photos? I looked at our wedding picture on his desk. Both of us smiling, unaware that I was being hired for a position rather than entering a partnership. Especially those. David's phone rang. His lawyer friend from the sound of the conversation. I could hear him dictating terms, precise legal language that transformed my emotional disaster into paperwork. Termination of cohabitation. 48 hours for retrieval. No direct contact. All communication through designated representative. By noon our townhouse had been transformed. 63 boxes lined the entryway, each one labeled with Tyler's name and a general description of contents. The walls showed pale rectangles where his pictures had hung. The closet looked cavernous with just my clothes. The bathroom counter suddenly had space for my things to spread out instead of being crammed into one corner. This needs your signature, David said, presenting the formal notice his lawyer friend had drafted. It was beautiful in its simplicity. No emotion, no accusations, just facts. Tyler's belongings were packed. He had 48 hours to collect them. The locks had been changed. Any attempt at direct contact would be considered harassment. I signed it with my good hand, the pen awkward but manageable. It felt like signing discharge papers for a patient who'd been taking up bed space for far too long, preventing someone who actually needed care from getting help. I'll have this delivered by certified mail, David said. He'll get it today. He'll say I'm overreacting. That I'm being dramatic. Let him say it to the boxes. Rosa approached with her final inventory sheet. 63 boxes total. Everything photographed and documented. We can store them if they're not picked up within the specified time frame. 63 boxes. 8 years of Tyler's presence in my life reduced to a number on a moving company's form. It seemed both too many and not enough to show for nearly a decade of marriage. Thank you, I told Rosa, meaning it. She'd handled his things with more care than he'd shown for my emergency. Honey, this is what we do, she said, her professional mask slipping just slightly. And between you and me, the ones who prioritize lunch dates over hospital visits? They usually end up realizing what they lost about 3 months too late. The doorbell camera alert came at 2:47 Saturday afternoon. David was in the kitchen making sandwiches, insisting I needed to eat something besides Mrs. Chen's divorce soup, when my phone buzzed with the motion detection notification. I almost didn't look, thinking it might be a delivery driver or someone turning around in the driveway. But something made me open the app. Tyler stood on the doorstep looking like someone had removed his batteries. His usually perfect hair stuck up at odd angles, yesterday's work shirt wrinkled and untucked on one side. Behind him, Eleanor Wilson emerged from her black Mercedes wearing sunglasses despite the overcast sky, her mouth set in a line so tight it could have been drawn with a ruler. They're here, I said to David, who immediately abandoned the sandwiches to stand behind me, watching the small screen over my shoulder. Tyler raised his hand toward the doorbell, then let it drop. He turned to look at his mother, who was already approaching with the determined stride of someone handling an unpleasant but necessary task. Through the camera's audio I could hear their conversation. "Just ring it, Tyler." She changed the locks. "She's not going to answer." "Then we use the intercom." "Stand up straight. You look pathetic." Eleanor pressed the doorbell with one manicured finger, the sound echoing through my townhouse like a judge's gavel. I didn't move from the couch. David squeezed my good shoulder gently, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone this time. After 30 seconds, Eleanor pressed the intercom button. Her voice crackled through the speaker with the same tone she'd used at family dinners when asking the housekeeper to clear the plates. "Hannah, this is Eleanor Wilson. We're here to collect Tyler's belongings as specified in your notice. Please confirm the items are ready for removal." Not, "How are you feeling after your accident?" Not, "I'm sorry this happened." Just business, which was honestly more honest than she'd been in 8 years of pretending I was good enough for her son. David reached over and pressed the respond button. "Mrs. Wilson, this is David, Hannah's brother. The boxes are in the entryway. The door will unlock remotely. Please complete the removal within 30 minutes. There was a pause before Eleanor responded, her voice even colder. "Understood." David pressed the remote unlock and I watched through the camera as Tyler pushed open the door he used to walk through without thinking. He stopped just inside the threshold, staring at the wall of boxes like they were written in a foreign language. His mouth moved, but the camera didn't pick up what he said. Eleanor pushed past him, surveying the packed items with the efficiency of someone conducting an inventory. "Start loading," she instructed Tyler, who still hadn't moved. "The sooner we finish this, the better." Tyler picked up the first box, labeled office supplies, and I watched his face change as he registered what was happening. This wasn't a dramatic gesture he could talk his way out of. This was real, final, boxed and labeled with the kind of precision that left no room for negotiation. He carried the box to the Mercedes, walking like someone underwater. Eleanor supervised from the doorway, occasionally directing him to be careful with certain boxes, treating the whole process like a business transaction she needed to oversee but didn't want to soil her hands with. On his third trip, Tyler stopped at a box labeled wedding photos, and stood there for a full minute just staring at the label. His shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen before, like someone had let the air out of him. Eleanor's sharp voice cut through whatever moment he was having. "Tyler, we don't have all day. Charlotte has been calling you repeatedly." Charlotte. Even now, even during this, she was still the priority. Tyler picked up the box and continued his mechanical journey to the car. I found myself studying him through the camera, this man I'd spent 8 years with, and realized I was looking at a stranger. Without his confidence, his carefully maintained image, his certainty that the world would always bend to accommodate him, he looked hollow. Younger somehow, like a child forced to clean up a mess he'd made but didn't understand. "Kitchen items, expensive," Tyler read from one box, hefting it carefully. The copper pans he'd insisted we needed, though he'd never cooked a single meal. The espresso machine that cost $2,000 and made coffee that tasted identical to our old machine. The mandolin slicer still in its original packaging. Eleanor remained at her post by the door, occasionally checking her phone, probably calculating how this embarrassment would affect her social standing. She'd have to explain to her book club why her daughter-in-law wasn't at family functions anymore. Have to find a new narrative for Tyler's sudden single status that didn't involve him abandoning his injured wife for a lunch date. Box by box, Tyler emptied the entryway. His designer clothes, his exercise equipment he'd used twice, his collection of watches, his golf trophies from company tournaments. Each trip to the car seemed to take something out of him, his steps getting heavier, his face growing more haggard. On what must have been his 15th trip, he stopped at a small box labeled Miscellaneous Personal, and opened it right there in the entryway. I could see him pull out something small. His college class ring, maybe, or the cufflinks his grandfather had left him. He stood there holding whatever it was, his back to the camera, shoulders shaking slightly. "Tyler." Eleanor's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "This is neither the time nor the place for dramatics." Dramatics. The same word he'd used about my accident. It must have been a family favorite, pulled out whenever emotions threatened to make things inconvenient. He closed the box and carried it out, but when he came back for the next load, his eyes were red. Whether from tears or lack of sleep, I couldn't tell, and found I didn't particularly care. The whole process took 22 minutes. 8 years of accumulation, 22 minutes of removal. Tyler made one last sweep of the entryway, checking for anything missed, and for just a moment he looked directly at the doorbell camera. Our eyes met through the digital divide and I saw something I'd never seen before in his face. Understanding. Not regret exactly, not an apology, but a recognition of what he'd thrown away for a Thursday lunch. Eleanor appeared beside him. Is that everything? Yeah, Tyler said, his voice barely audible through the speaker. That's everything. Eleanor reached for the intercom one last time. The items have been collected. Tyler wanted me to. She paused and for the first time her composure cracked slightly. He wanted me to tell you he left his house key on the kitchen counter last week. Last week. Before the accident. He'd already been pulling away, probably planning his exit strategy while I was working extra shifts and making his breakfast. The information should have hurt, but instead, it felt like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. They left without another word. The Mercedes pulling away with 63 boxes of Tyler's life crammed into its trunk and back seat. I watched until the car turned the corner and disappeared, taking with it 8 years of my life I'd never get back but no longer wanted. David helped me stand and together we walked through the townhouse. The bathroom counter looked enormous without Tyler's arsenal of products. The closet seemed to echo with all its empty space. The living room wall showed pale rectangles where his diplomas and awards had hung, like ghosts of achievements that had never been quite as impressive as he'd pretended. I stood in the empty living room for a moment longer, running my good hand along the wall where Tyler's diploma had hung. The paint was slightly brighter there, protected from years of sunlight, a perfect rectangle of what used to be. David was already in the kitchen, finishing those sandwiches he'd abandoned earlier, when my phone buzzed with a text from my coworker Melissa. 2 weeks had passed since the boxes left with Eleanor's Mercedes. 2 weeks of learning to exist in spaces that felt too big, too quiet, too mine. My shoulder was healing, the stitches had come out, and I'd returned to work part-time against David's protests that I needed more rest. You'll never guess who I saw last night, Melissa's text read. Your ex at Murphy's bar downtown, absolutely plastered, telling everyone at the bar that you overreacted to a fender bender. Said Charlotte was having a mental health crisis and needed him more. The bartender finally cut him off when he started crying into his whiskey. I read the message twice, picturing Tyler at Murphy's, a dive bar he would have called beneath him 6 months ago. Now he was there, drunk and desperate, spinning a narrative where he was the victim of his dramatic wife's overreaction. The same man who'd suggested I take an Uber from the emergency room was now crying into cheap whiskey about being misunderstood. He actually said Charlotte was suicidal. Melissa's next text arrived. Like that justified everything. But get this. My cousin Sarah works at Charlotte's firm. She's been posting beach photos from Cabo all week. Some mental health crisis. So Charlotte had fled to Mexico rather than deal with the fallout of Tyler's availability. The woman whose endless crises had demanded his immediate attention every Thursday for months had disappeared the moment she could actually have him. There was something almost poetic about it. I didn't respond to Melissa. What was there to say? That I wasn't surprised? That Tyler discovering what abandonment felt like was justice served cold? Instead, I went back to counting pills and filling prescriptions, the routine movements soothing in their predictability. A month later, on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, Richard Wilson walked into the pharmacy. Tyler's father looked older than I remembered, his usually perfect suit slightly rumpled, the kind of exhaustion in his eyes that came from disappointment rather than lack of sleep. Hannah, he said, approaching the counter with obvious discomfort. I didn't expect. That is, I usually go to the CVS across town. Your blood pressure medication? I asked, already pulling up his profile in our system. Professional, neutral, like he was any other customer. Yes. The doctor increased the dosage. Stress, you understand. I did understand. The gossip network at Riverside General was efficient and comprehensive. Tyler had been making mistakes at his father's firm. Lost 3 major clients in 2 weeks by missing meetings, submitting error-filled reports, showing up late and disheveled. The golden boy who'd been handed a corner office was tarnishing fast. Tyler's been struggling, Richard said quietly while I prepared his prescription. He calls in sick every Thursday now. Says he can't face that day of the week. And Charlotte, she won't return his calls. Changed her number apparently. Every Thursday. The day that had been sacred for their lunches was now the day Tyler couldn't function. He finally understood what it felt like to be abandoned by someone you thought cared about you, except Charlotte had simply stopped answering, while he'd actively chosen lunch over my emergency. That must be difficult, I said, maintaining the same tone I used with any customer discussing personal problems. Richard studied my face for a moment, perhaps looking for anger or satisfaction. He found neither. I had become very good at professional neutrality in the past month. He's been driving past the accident site, Richard added. The intersection where it happened. His mother thinks he's punishing himself. I handed him the prescription bag. Will that be all today, Mr. Wilson? He nodded, understanding the boundary I'd drawn. As he left, I wondered if Tyler really drove past that intersection, if he pictured the pickup truck crushing my door, if he finally understood that some moments couldn't be undone with apologies or explanations. 2 months after the accident, exactly 2 months to the day, a 3-page email appeared in my inbox before my automatic filter could catch it. Tyler had used a different email address, probably created just for this purpose. The subject line read, "Please read, I finally understand." Against my better judgment, I opened it. The email was a masterpiece of manipulation dressed as revelation. He claimed stress from work had clouded his judgment. Charlotte had told him she was having suicidal thoughts, though she was currently posting sunset photos from Cabo. His anxiety disorder, never previously mentioned in 8 years, had made him freeze in crisis situations. He'd been in therapy for 2 weeks. He'd driven to the accident site and finally understood the trauma I'd experienced 2 months too late. "I see now how wrong I was," he wrote. "When I stood at that intersection, I imagined you trapped in the car, bleeding, afraid, reaching out to me, and I wasn't there. I was eating overpriced salmon while you were fighting for your life." The salmon detail was oddly specific and somehow made everything worse. He remembered what he'd been eating while I bled. "We could try counseling," the email continued. "I've already found a therapist who specializes in trauma and relationship repair. I know I failed you, but doesn't 8 years deserve a second chance?" 8 years. He was right about the time but wrong about everything else. 8 years didn't deserve anything. 8 years was just time spent, not automatic credit toward forgiveness. I read the email once, then set up an automatic filter for his new address too. Any email containing Tyler or Wilson would go straight to trash. No notification, no temptation to read, just digital silence. David called that afternoon while I was on my lunch break, his voice carrying barely suppressed amusement. "You're not going to believe what happened today. Tyler showed up at your office?" Showed up is understating it. He was waiting in the parking lot at 7 a.m., looking like he'd slept in his car, begging me to talk to you, saying he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. I could picture it perfectly. Tyler, who'd always been so concerned with appearances, now desperate enough to ambush my brother in a parking lot like something from a bad movie. Security had to escort him out? I guessed. After he started shouting about true love and second chances. The whole office watched through the windows. My secretary filmed it, actually. He kept saying, "She's my wife, I love her," over and over, like saying it enough would make it true retroactively. He never said it when it mattered. No, David agreed. He was too busy at lunch to say it when it mattered. The image of Tyler being escorted from David's building while proclaiming his love was both pathetic and oddly satisfying. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because he was finally experiencing consequences. For 8 years his choices had been cushioned by my accommodation. Now he was learning what life felt like without that safety net. "Hannah, you're glowing," Melissa said, holding up a champagne flute filled with grocery store sparkling wine that tasted better than any expensive vintage Tyler had ever insisted we needed. "Seriously, you look 10 years younger." 6 months had transformed more than just my living space. The dinner party sprawled through my townhouse. Colleagues from the pharmacy, 2 neighbors including Mrs. Chin, my book club friends who Tyler had called intellectually pedestrian, and David, of course, manning the kitchen with the confidence of someone who actually enjoyed cooking. I'd served dinner on plates I'd found at 3 different thrift stores last month. None of them matched, but somehow they looked perfect together. A blue one with tiny flowers, a yellow one with geometric patterns, a plain white one with a small chip that gave it character. Tyler would have been mortified. I found them delightful. Tell the story about the guy with the fish. Someone called out and Patricia, my former ER nurse, launched into a tale about a patient who'd arrived with a live goldfish in a bag, insisting it needed medical attention. Everyone laughed, the kind of genuine belly-deep laughter that had been absent from this house for years. No one worried about appearing sophisticated. No one checked their watches. No one mentioned Charlotte or Tyler or Thursday lunches. The next morning I had my final follow-up with Dr. Webb at Riverside General. He manipulated my shoulder through its full range of motion, nodding with satisfaction at each movement. "Perfect recovery," he announced, then paused, studying the thin silver lines on my forehead where the stitches had been. "The scars are barely visible. Another few months and you probably won't see them at all." "They don't bother me," I said, meaning it. Those scars were proof of survival, evidence of the moment everything changed. Dr. Webb sat back, his expression shifting from professional to personal. I went through something similar 5 years ago. Not a car accident, but a moment when trauma revealed what was already broken. My ex-wife brought divorce papers to the hospital when I was recovering from emergency surgery. That's awful. I thought so at the time. But looking back, that surgery didn't end my marriage. It just exposed what had been dying for years while we both pretended everything was fine. Sometimes it takes a collision, literal or metaphorical, to show us we've been living in wreckage all along. His words stayed with me as I drove home, taking a route I'd been avoiding for 6 months. The intersection of 5th and Madison looked different in daylight, busier, more ordinary than the site of personal catastrophe it had become in my memory. I stopped at the red light, the same light the college kid had run that night, and waited. The intersection was just pavement and painted lines. No evidence of the accident remained, no skid marks or broken glass, nothing to mark it as the place where my life split into before and after. Cars moved through in their usual patterns. People crossed the street absorbed in their phones. Life continued its rhythm, indifferent to the history that had unfolded here. When the light turned green, I didn't move immediately. Instead, I thought about that kid in the lifted pickup, probably 19 or 20, who'd changed everything by running this light. I'd learned from the police report that he'd been sober, just young and stupid and racing to meet friends. His insurance had covered everything. He'd sent a letter through his lawyer apologizing profusely, saying he'd have nightmares about it forever. I'd wanted to write back to tell him that his recklessness had accidentally saved me. That his inability to stop at a red light had forced me to stop accepting less than I deserved. That sometimes destruction was the only way to create space for something better. But how do you thank someone for nearly killing you? How do you explain that their worst moment had become your liberation? The car behind me honked gently, pulling me back to the present. I drove through the intersection feeling lighter somehow, like I'd left something heavy behind on that corner. Thursday afternoon had arrived without fanfare. I'd worked my usual shift, come home to my quiet townhouse, changed into comfortable clothes that Tyler would have called frumpy. No elaborate dinner to prepare. No watching the clock to make sure everything was ready when he walked through the door after his extended lunch. Just me, a cup of tea, and a book I'd bought because the cover was pretty and the summary sounded interesting. The book was a mystery novel, the kind Tyler had dismissed as commercial fiction for people who don't really read. I was thoroughly absorbed in chapter 12 when my phone buzzed. David's name appeared on the screen. "Just checking in. You doing okay?" I looked around my townhouse, at the mismatched plates drying in the rack, at the throw pillows I'd chosen because they were soft instead of stylish, at the walls now decorated with photos that made me smile instead of impressed visitors. The afternoon sun slanted through windows no longer covered by the expensive blinds Tyler had insisted we needed, replaced by simple curtains I'd sewn myself last month. "You know what?" I typed back. For the first time in years, genuinely yes. "Good. Want to grab dinner Sunday? That new Thai place open near you." "Sounds perfect." I set the phone aside and returned to my book, tucking my feet under me on the couch that was now entirely mine to sprawl across. Outside, I could hear kids playing in the street, their laughter carrying through the open window. Mrs. Chen was probably in her garden, humming the Chinese songs she'd taught her grandchildren. Normal neighborhood sounds that had always been there, but I'd been too busy managing Tyler's moods to notice. The Thursday afternoon stretched ahead of me, empty of obligations or anxiety. No wondering when Tyler would come home. No preparing explanations for why dinner was simple or why I was tired or why I hadn't organized his dry cleaning. No checking my phone to see if Charlotte's crisis would extend his absence. Just peace, earned through pain but worth every moment of the journey that brought me here. I thought about Tyler occasionally, the way you think about a movie you once watched but can't quite remember the ending. He existed now in the past tense, a character from a different story, one I'd closed and shelved and had no interest in rereading. The anger had faded months ago, replaced by something that wasn't quite indifference but wasn't forgiveness either. It was simply done, finished, a chapter that ended when that pickup truck rearranged more than just metal and glass. My shoulder barely ached anymore, just occasional stiffness when the weather changed. The scars on my forehead had faded to thin lines that looked like worry marks, evidence of a life lived rather than a trauma survived. Everything had healed, bones, skin, and finally the parts of me I hadn't realized were broken until they started mending. I turned the page of my book, settling deeper into the couch, and smiled at nothing in particular. It was Thursday afternoon, I was alone and I was happy. Genuinely, completely, peacefully happy. The architecture of my new life was simple but solid, built on foundations I'd chosen rather than inherited, decorated with joy rather than obligation. This was what freedom felt like, not dramatic or triumphant, just quiet and true and entirely mine. If this story of poetic justice had you rooting for Hannah's comeback, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when the police walked into the Sterling room, exposing Tyler's priorities to everyone. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more gripping stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.